Today, we will be looking at 14 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Each story stands on its own, exposing how a single misstep, misjudgment, or stroke of bad luck deep underground can unleash devastating consequences. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The hills of Texas hide many secrets beneath their surface. One of the most dangerous lies just outside Wimberley in Hayes County, where Jacob's Well opens into the earth like a deceptive invitation. What appears as a peaceful spring-fed pool masks one of the deadliest underwater cave systems in America. On the evening of November 23rd, 1983, two young men would learn this truth too late, leading towards an unimaginable betrayal. Richard Patton was 22 years old and passionate about diving. He and his companion were both students in an advanced diving class at Southwest Texas State University. Their instructors described them as extremely experienced and very intelligent divers. They knew the risks of cave diving and had the skills to handle most underwater challenges. But Jacob's Well was different from other dive sites. Signs posted around the spring warned visitors that diving was strictly prohibited. The warnings existed for good reason. Over the previous decades, numerous divers had lost their lives in the cave's dark passages. The spring had earned a deadly reputation among the diving community. Despite the warnings, Patton and his friend decided to explore the forbidden cave that Wednesday evening. They arrived at Jacob's Well around 8:30 p.m., equipped with standard scuba gear and underwater lights. The surface of the water looked calm and inviting in the fading daylight. The two divers entered the water and began their descent into the cave system. Jacob's Well drops straight down through limestone walls, creating a vertical shaft that extends deep into the earth. As they descended, the natural light from the surface faded, leaving only their artificial lights to guide the way. As they descended into the dark limestone shaft, neither diver attached a guideline to mark their path back to the surface. This critical safety measure, standard practice in cave diving, would have provided them with a direct route to the entrance no matter how disoriented they became in the maze of passages below. Without this lifeline, they were diving blind into one of the most dangerous underwater cave systems in the world. At approximately 90 feet, 27 meters below the surface, they reached a critical point in the cave system. Here, a small passage led deeper into the underground network. This passage had been sealed with a metal grate in 1979 after rescue teams failed to recover a body from beyond that point. The authorities had installed the barrier to prevent other divers from venturing into the most dangerous part of the cave. But when Patton and his companion arrived at the 90-foot mark, they discovered the metal grate was gone. Someone had removed or destroyed the safety barrier, leaving the deadly passage open once again. Faced with the open passage, the two divers made a decision that would prove catastrophic. They decided to continue deeper into the cave system. The passage ahead was too narrow for them to swim through while wearing their bulky scuba tanks on their backs. To proceed, they removed their tanks and began pushing the heavy equipment ahead of them through the tight space. They kept the breathing hoses in their mouths, drawing air from the tanks as they moved forward. This technique, while risky, allowed experienced divers to navigate spaces too small for normal scuba diving. The limestone walls pressed in around them as they squeezed deeper into the narrow tunnel. Every movement had to be calculated and careful. The passage seemed to grow tighter with each push forward, the rough stones scraping against their equipment and bodies. Their lights cast eerie shadows on the cave walls, creating a maze of rock formations that all looked identical in the darkness. Then, disaster struck. The passage was more difficult than they expected. As they worked their way through the narrow limestone tunnel, Patton's tank became wedged against the cave walls. Despite their efforts, they could not free the trapped equipment. The tank was stuck fast, and their air supply was now divided between them. Both divers made the decision to abandon the jammed tank. They would have to share the remaining air supply and retreat to the surface immediately. This technique, called buddy breathing, required them to pass the breathing regulator back and forth, taking turns breathing from the single tank. With their air supply limited and time running out, Patton and his companion began their emergency ascent toward the cave entrance. In the dark, confusing maze of underwater passages, navigation became critical. One wrong turn could mean the difference between life and death. But in their haste and with their attention focused on sharing the dwindling air supply, the two divers made a fatal error. Instead of following the passage back to the main entrance, they swam up into what cave divers call a blind chimney. This dead-end passage led upward but had no connection to the surface. As they ascended the false passage, their shared air supply continued to diminish. When they reached the top of the chimney, they discovered their mistake. Above them was solid rock, not the opening to Jacob's well. They were trapped in a dead end with almost no air remaining. With seconds left before their air ran out completely, the unthinkable happened. Faced with the choice between certain death for both of them or trying to save himself, Patton's companion made the most agonizing decision a person can face underwater. In what must have felt like the ultimate betrayal to both men, he abandoned his friend in the blind chimney. The companion left Patton alone in the dark, dead-end passage and swam back down, hoping to find the correct route to the surface. It was a desperate gamble that went against every instinct of partnership and loyalty that divers depend on. But with their air supply exhausted and both men facing death, someone had to try to reach the surface to call for help. Fighting against panic and oxygen deprivation, he managed to locate the proper route and swam to safety. The companion surfaced at Jacob's well, gasping for air and calling for help. But Richard Patton remained trapped in the underwater dead end, with no air supply and no way to reach the surface. Search and rescue teams arrived quickly, but it was too late to save Patton. The young diver had drowned in the blind chimney, another victim of Jacob's well's deadly maze. On Thursday morning, November 24th, recovery divers brought his body to the surface. The tragedy made headlines across Texas. Newspapers reported the story of the experienced diver who had lost his life in the forbidden cave. The Austin American-Statesman ran an article titled, "Divers Feel Deadly Fascination for Treachery of Jacob's Well," highlighting the spring's dangerous attraction for underwater explorers. Cave diving experts who analyzed the incident identified several factors that contributed to Patton's death. The missing safety grate had removed a crucial barrier that was installed specifically to prevent divers from entering the most dangerous part of the cave system. Without this warning, the passage appeared navigable to experienced divers. The decision to remove their tanks and push them through the narrow passage was a recognized technique among advanced cave divers, but it significantly increased the risk of equipment problems. When Patton's tank became jammed, it created an emergency situation that required perfect execution to survive. Most critically, the divers had not used a guideline to mark their route through the cave system. Guidelines are considered essential safety equipment for cave diving because they provide a reliable path back to the entrance. In the dark, disorienting environment of an underwater cave, even experienced divers can become confused about direction and distance. If Patton and his companion had installed a guideline at the beginning of their dive, they would have been able to follow it directly back to the entrance instead of swimming into the deadly blind chimney. Patton's death was not an isolated incident. Jacob's Well had already claimed numerous lives over the previous decades, earning its reputation as one of the most dangerous dive sites in America. Each year, water-filled caves across the country claim the lives of divers who underestimate their deadly nature. What makes these tragedies particularly heartbreaking is that many of the victims are skilled and experienced divers who understand the risks of this sport. On May 27, 2008, experienced caver Steve Gladieux prepared to lead what should have been a routine through trip in the Sloan Valley Cave system. The plan was straightforward: enter through the post office entrance at 11 a.m. and emerge at the garbage pit entrance by 6 p.m., guiding 8 novice cavers through one of the region's most spectacular underground routes. When morning came, 2 novices admitted they were too exhausted to tackle the challenging cave system safely. Steve made the responsible decision to leave them at the surface, reducing his group to 7 inexperienced cavers who were about to face conditions that would test every limit of their endurance. At 11 a.m. sharp, Steve led his team into the 25-foot, 7.6-meter chimney that marked the post office entrance. The initial descent went smoothly, and the group's spirits were high as they explored the cave's magnificent passages, including the ethereal Fountain of Youth and the breathtaking vista from the big room's north overlook. As the day progressed, Steve could see fatigue affecting his group. The constant crawling, climbing, and navigating through tight passages was taking its toll, but they still had a significant portion of the route ahead. Knowing the return trip would require 2.5 hours of demanding caving, Steve decided to push forward toward their planned exit. At the big room's south overlook, Steve discovered someone had cut the fixed bolts that normally provided secure rappelling anchors. Undeterred, he improvised a solution, carefully lowering each team member about 8 feet, 2.4 meters, down to a narrow ledge below using a munter hitch technique. As they approached the next section, Steve noticed something that made his blood run cold. The water level throughout the cave system was dramatically higher than normal, a staggering 35 feet, 10.7 meters, above usual levels. What should have been dry or shallow passages were now filled with dark, frigid water that transformed familiar routes into potentially deadly obstacles. The group encountered thigh-deep water crossing through sections of the big room, the cold liquid seeping through their clothing and sapping their body heat. They successfully navigated the hogback formation, but their optimism was about to be shattered. When they reached Echo Junction, Steve realized they faced a crisis that could trap them underground indefinitely. The bypass route that normally allowed spelunkers to avoid the deepest water was completely submerged, creating a 175-foot, 53-meter, underwater passage through pitch-black, freezing water with no guarantee of air pockets. Of the 7 team members, only 2 possessed fully waterproof headlamps, equipment that was now the difference between life and death in the flooded passages. Without adequate lighting, attempting the swim would be suicidal. In a moment of remarkable courage, Darshan, one of the novices, volunteered to make the treacherous swim. Despite his limited experience, he understood someone needed to cross the passage with a waterproof light to guide the others safely through the submerged route. Steve attached a 70-foot, 21-meter rope to a dry bag buoy, giving Darshan a guideline for the rest of the team to follow. With grim determination, Darshan entered the frigid water and began swimming into the absolute darkness ahead. The 175-foot passage felt endless as Darshan fought against the cold water that drained his strength with every stroke. His breathing became labored as swimming in full caving gear while towing equipment pushed his body beyond its limits. The waterproof headlamp provided only a narrow cone of light in the vast darkness. As Darshan neared what he hoped was the end of the swim, his muscles began to fail. The combination of cold water, physical exhaustion, and psychological stress finally overwhelmed his reserves. Darshan's terrified cry echoed through the water-filled chamber before his strength gave out completely and he disappeared beneath the dark surface, his waterproof light vanishing into the depths. Steve, whose lifeguard training had prepared him for water emergencies, didn't hesitate. He plunged into the icy water, knowing his non-waterproof headlamp would immediately fail, leaving him to navigate by feel alone in pitch-black conditions. When Steve reached Darshan, he found the young man barely conscious, his head bobbing intermittently above the surface as he gasped for air. Panic had completely taken over, and Darshan's survival instincts kicked in with dangerous consequences. He grabbed onto Steve with a death grip, threatening to drag them both under. Fighting against both the brutal cold and Darshan's panicked struggles, Steve used every ounce of strength to push them both toward a steep, muddy bank along the side of the passage. When they reached the bank, Steve realized the true severity of Darshan's condition. The young man showed all the classic signs of severe hypothermia: dilated pupils, slurred and confused speech, unresponsive limbs, and most alarmingly, he had stopped shivering, indicating his core temperature had dropped to dangerously low levels. Steve forced Darshan to eat emergency food supplies to help generate internal heat, while calling to the other team members to keep him alert and responsive. Leaving Darshan in their care, Steve dove back into the flooded passage and swam toward the lake that led to the cave entrance, his own body now suffering from cold exposure. Steve successfully reached the surface and immediately alerted the two novices that remained at camp before running to a nearby landowner's house to call for a cave rescue team. The first rescue team member arrived within 10 minutes, but what followed was a heated argument about whether Steve should stay to guide rescuers or return immediately to provide care for Darshan. Steve's determination won out. Grabbing 200 feet, 61 meters of rescue rope, emergency supplies, warm, dry clothes, and a blanket, he stuffed everything into waterproof bags and prepared for another brutal swim through the flooded passages. 40 minutes after leaving Darshan's side, Steve was back in the flooded chamber. He immediately began field treatment for severe hypothermia, helping Darshan strip out of soaked clothing and drying him off as thoroughly as possible. The warm, dry clothes and emergency food began to show effect, and slowly, Darshan started improving. The rescue operation that followed was a testament to the cave rescue team's skill and dedication. Working in pitch-black conditions with frigid water up to their necks, rescuers carefully maneuvered Darshan across the treacherous lake system using specialized flotation devices and safety lines. The delicate operation took 5 hours to transport Darshan across the various water obstacles and through the complex cave passages to safety. Every movement had to be calculated and controlled to prevent him from being dropped back into the water or suffering additional injuries. The entire rescue operation lasted 11 grueling hours, from the moment Darshan disappeared beneath the water until he was finally brought to the surface. Thanks to Steve's quick thinking, lifeguard training, and absolute refusal to abandon his team member, Darshan survived what could easily have been a fatal case of hypothermia in one of the most challenging rescue environments imaginable. The Sloan Valley Cave Rescue became a case study in how quickly conditions can change in underground environments, and how proper training, quick decision-making, and unwavering determination can mean the difference between life and death when adventure turns to disaster in the depths of the earth. The Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on June 29, 2005, as students and instructors gathered at the entrance to Toluca Cave for the National Cave Rescue Commission's summer seminar. The group assembled at the rocky terrain of North Alabama, surrounded by sinkholes and limestone outcroppings that hinted at the vast underground network below. Their mission was clear: conduct a training exercise at the Skylight Room, navigating a 35-foot vertical drop, about 10.7 meters of sheer limestone wall. The scenario would simulate hauling an injured person up from the depths, a skill that could mean the difference between life and death in a real emergency. The group began their descent into Toluca Cave through the main entrance, a narrow opening that required crawling on hands and knees for the first 50 feet, 15 meters. The temperature dropped immediately to a constant 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius, and the familiar musty smell of limestone and bat guano filled their nostrils. After 20 minutes of careful navigation through twisting passages, they emerged into a larger chamber. The route to the Skylight Room demanded careful movement through 2 belly crawls, through restrictions followed by a breakdown zone, an area where a part of the cave ceiling had collapsed centuries ago, leaving house-sized boulders scattered across their path. The group carefully picked their way through the narrow passages and the obstacle course. Finally, they reached the Skylight Room, a magnificent chamber roughly. The room got its name from a natural shaft that led to the surface, though no actual daylight penetrated the 35-foot, 10.7-meter vertical drop. The instructors gathered the group around the pit edge. This would be their training ground, a place to simulate hauling an injured person up from the bottom of the drop. The exercise required a volunteer to serve as the patient, someone willing to be lowered into the pit and hauled back out to test their rescue system. Time Lon stepped forward to volunteer. At 41 years old, Lon possessed the steady nerve and experience that made him perfect for the role. His background in vertical cave work and rope systems gave the instructors confidence that he could handle the physical and psychological demands of the exercise. The pit itself seemed ominous in ways that were difficult to articulate. The walls were almost perfectly cylindrical, polished by millennia of water flow. The next hour was spent in meticulous preparation. The instructors supervised as students assembled a complex rigging system using static climbing ropes rated for 9,000 pounds, 4,082 kilograms of tensile strength. They installed anchors in solid rock, tested every connection, and established communication protocols. 2 students were designated as edge attendants. Their job was to guide the rope and prevent it from abrading against the sharp limestone edge. A comprehensive safety check followed the rigging setup, with every piece of equipment inspected twice. Lon donned his seat harness, connected his rappel device, and clipped into the hauling line. The system looked flawless, a textbook setup that had been used successfully hundreds of times in training exercises across the country. Lon announced his readiness and began his descent over the lip of the pit. The team above began feeding rope through the mechanical advantage system they had constructed. He slowly disappeared over the lip. The lowering operation proceeded with textbook precision. Every few feet, Lon would call out his status. The edge attendants worked with practiced efficiency, ensuring the rope moved cleanly over a padded edge protector designed to prevent damage to both rope and rock. The team began reconfiguring their rope system, transforming it from a lowering setup to a mechanical advantage hauling system, capable of lifting a 200-pound, 91-kilogram patient with relative ease. The mechanical advantage meant that 6 people working together could lift Lon's weight with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The hauling command echoed through the chamber, and the team began their coordinated effort. The rope stretched slightly under load, then began moving through the system with smooth precision. Somewhere below, Lon was ascending slowly but steadily toward the surface, suspended in his harness and trusting completely in the system. One edge attendant called out that the patient was 15 feet up from the bottom, roughly 20 feet, 6.1 meters from the surface and more than halfway through the haul. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, with smooth precision that characterized successful rescue operations. It was at that moment that disaster struck. A sharp crack echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, followed by the grinding scrape of stone against stone as limestone gave way to forces that had been building invisibly. Several chunks of limestone, each the size of a bowling ball, broke free from the lip and began their deadly plunge toward the bottom of the drop. The first rock fell with the acceleration of gravity above Lon's position. Below, suspended in his harness and unable to take evasive action, Lon had perhaps a heartbeat to react. His training kicked in instinctively. He raised his left arm to protect his head and torso, turning slightly in his harness just as the first rock reached him. The limestone chunk struck his forearm with a sickening impact, the force spinning him like a pendulum in the narrow confines of the pit. A second rock, bigger and sharper, followed immediately behind. Lon, still spinning from the initial impact and disoriented by pain, was powerless to avoid it. The second projectile struck him squarely in the lower back, the force driving the air from his lungs in an audible gasp that echoed up from the depths. The chamber erupted into panic. The training exercise now turned into a real rescue operation. The team immediately reversed the rope system, their hauling operation becoming an emergency lowering. Below, they could hear Lon groaning in pain. Calls echoed down, seeking confirmation that Lon was conscious and assessing his injuries. A weak but coherent response drifted up from the darkness, confirming consciousness but indicating significant pain in his arm and back, the 2 impact points where the falling rocks had struck. The lowering seemed to take forever, though it lasted less than 2 minutes. When Lon finally reached the bottom again, instructors were already preparing to rappel down for medical assessment. One team member raced toward the cave entrance to establish communication with the outside world and prepare for medical evacuation. The underground assessment revealed blunt force trauma from falling objects, with impacts to his arm and torso. The first rock had struck his left arm with enough force to cause severe bruising. The second impact to his lower back had targeted the kidney area, raising concerns about internal injuries. The decision was made to evacuate Lon through a horizontal entrance roughly 300 yards, 274 meters away, avoiding vertical work with loose rock still threatening the pit area. The journey would mean nearly half a mile of underground travel, but it was infinitely safer than attempting another vertical evacuation. After 45 minutes, they emerged from the horizontal entrance. An ambulance was waiting, and paramedics immediately took over Lon's care, preparing him for transport to the nearest emergency. Hospital x-rays and CT scans revealed severe bruising to his left arm and significant trauma to his lower back. The impact had caused internal bruising and a bone bruise on his pelvic crest, requiring weeks of recovery. Miraculously, no bones were broken, and he was released after overnight observation. The incident became a case study in cave rescue, highlighting how rope movement during hauling operations could gradually undermine rock at pit edges. The limestone, weakened by millennia of erosion, had reached a critical point where additional stress caused catastrophic failure. For everyone involved, the incident became a defining moment, a visceral reminder that underground emergencies could develop with terrifying speed, requiring split-second decisions and flawless execution under pressure. It was January 4th, 1989, when three experienced spelunkers walked into what should have been a routine scouting mission in Mexico. Cynthia Van, Ray Hardcastle, and John Pint were exploring Cueva de la Venta, a massive lava tube near Tequila Volcano. Cueva de la Venta stretched before them like a giant's tunnel, carved by ancient lava flows that had cooled and hardened thousands of years ago. The cave was famous among local spelunkers for its 75 entrances, each one perfectly spaced along the tube's length like windows in a subway tunnel. These natural skylights had earned the cave its nickname among locals, the Gallery of Light. It seemed like the perfect place for a quick look around. They traveled light that day, just one 6-volt flashlight and a small disposable light that was almost dead. Since most of the cave was naturally lit, they figured they wouldn't need much equipment. The first part of their journey was beautiful. Sunlight streamed through the entrances, creating these amazing light patterns on the smooth lava walls. They moved through this bright corridor easily, examining rock formations. The temperature inside the cave remained pleasantly cool, a welcome relief from the building heat outside. The smooth floor made walking easy, though they remained cautious of loose rocks and sudden changes in elevation. As they progressed deeper into the cave system, things started to change. The entrances became fewer and farther apart. The natural light began to fade. Eventually, they reached a section where the wide tunnel suddenly narrowed into a dark canyon. At floor level, the passage was only about a foot wide, barely 30 centimeters. Above their heads, it opened up to about 5 feet across, roughly 1.5 meters. The cheerful sunlight was completely gone here. Their world shrunk down to whatever their single flashlight could show them. Cynthia switched it on, and the beam cut through the darkness ahead. They squeezed into the narrow passage, moving sideways in single file. The walls pressed against their bodies. Every sound seemed amplified in the confined space. The darkness beyond their small circle of light felt heavy and endless. They kept moving deeper into the mountain. The passage seemed to go on much longer than expected. The walls stayed narrow at the bottom, forcing them to continue moving sideways. The temperature started to change too, becoming warmer and more humid. Then their flashlight began to dim. The battery was dying faster than they thought it would. The beam grew weaker with each step. They were deep inside the mountain now, far from the last entrance they had passed. The reality of their situation started to sink in. They had to keep moving forward. Standing still meant being trapped when the light died completely. The 6-volt flashlight flickered once, then it went out. Complete darkness swallowed them. The kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face. The kind that makes you feel like you're floating in empty space. They were now blind, trapped in a stone corridor with no way to see where they were going. John grabbed his nearly dead disposable flashlight. His hands were shaking as he found the switch. The weak beam came on, barely lighting up 3 feet ahead of them. That's when they saw it. Stretched across the narrow passage was a massive snake, 6 feet long, almost 2 meters, coiled up like a living roadblock. Its scales caught the dying light, and its head was raised, tongue flicking in and out, sensing the intruders. The snake had been sleeping in the warm passage when their footsteps woke it up. Now it was awake, alert, and blocking their only way forward. Cynthia accidentally stepped onto it, making it even more aggressive. The snake's eyes reflected the weak light as it stared at them. Its body was thick and powerful, muscles visible beneath the patterned scales. This was a predator in its own territory, and they were trespassing. They were initially shocked to encounter a snake. In years of caving, they usually don't come across such animals so deep inside a cave. Most people think lava tubes are empty, lifeless places. But Cueva de la Venta was different. Those 75 entrances that made the cave so beautiful also made it a perfect home for wildlife. The constant flow of air through the openings created a warm, humid environment that stayed the same temperature year-round. Small animals, bats, rodents, insects, even birds, regularly use these entrances as shelter from the harsh surface conditions. Where prey animals gather, predators follow. The steady warmth from the volcanic activity below, combined with the reliable food source above, made this cave system an ideal hunting ground for a large snake. The 6-foot serpent they encountered wasn't just passing through, it was a resident, an apex predator that had claimed this narrow section as its territory. It had probably been living in these tunnels for years, growing larger and more territorial with each successful hunt. The group had unknowingly entered its domain. Now, a low hiss filled the narrow space. The snake's mouth opened slightly and they could see its fangs. Its striking range was at least 2 feet, over half a meter. In that confined passage, there was nowhere to dodge. The disposable flashlight was getting dimmer. They could hear the snake moving, repositioning itself, its scales scraping against the stone. The creature seemed to sense their vulnerability. Then, their last light died. Absolute darkness returned. But now the silence was broken by the sound of the snake moving. They could hear it breathing, hissing softly, shifting its massive body across the floor. The creature was invisible, but very much there, blocking their escape. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The snake's presence filled that narrow space, and they knew one wrong step could trigger an attack. That's when Hardcastle made his decision. He started backing away slowly, feeling his way along the wall in complete darkness. If he could make it back to the last entrance, maybe he could find something to help. It was their only chance. Moving through that dark passage was terrifying. Every step had to be perfect. One stumble could make enough noise to alert the snake. The hissing grew fainter as he moved away, but he knew his friends were still trapped back there. When he finally reached daylight, he searched frantically for anything useful. He found a fallen pole about 8 feet long, roughly 2.5 meters. It was weathered but still strong enough for what he had in mind. Going back into that darkness was even worse. He had to move quickly but quietly, carrying the long pole through the narrow passage. The snake's hissing grew louder as he got closer to where his friends waited. Working entirely by feel, he positioned the pole above the snake's body. The creature sensed the threat and started thrashing, trying to escape. But the same narrow walls that trapped the humans also trapped the snake. With the pole holding the snake down, they pressed themselves against the far wall, feeling the creature struggling just inches away. The snake's anger was intense, a constant hissing that echoed through the passage. Now, Hardcastle faced the most dangerous moment. He had to release the snake and get away before it could turn on him. In one quick motion, he lifted the branch and ran. The snake's fury followed them through the darkness. They stumbled and ran through the narrow passage, guided by memory and adrenaline. Behind them, the creature's hissing echoed off the walls like an angry steam engine. They didn't stop until they reached the main tunnel and its blessed natural light. Only then did they allow themselves to collapse, hearts still pounding from what they had just survived. January 4th, 1989. 3 cave explorers learned that even the most routine trip can turn deadly in seconds. They went in with basic equipment for a quick look around. They came out with a story that would stay with them forever. The cave is still there near Tequila Volcano. Its 75 entrances still let in the light. And somewhere in its dark depths, that 6-foot guardian probably still patrols its territory, waiting for the next person to wander too close. The York Grotto Cave explorers met at Woomer Cave in Pennsylvania on March 29, 2003 for what was supposed to be a routine organized trip. Mark Engel had planned the expedition, splitting the group into 2 teams to explore different sections of the cave system. Kevin Dunleavy, a 41-year-old experienced spelunker, led the second group deeper into the limestone passages. They had proper equipment, backup lights, and years of experience navigating tight spaces. But experience doesn't always protect you from the cave's ability to turn deadly in seconds. They reached a junction where a tight passage branched off toward the back of the cave. The passage led to something called the Shoemaker Room. Dunleavy had never been down this particular route himself, but other explorers had told him it was just a quick side trip, 10 to 20 minutes at most. They would be right back out. Those famous last words that have killed more spelunkers than any rockfall. The group made a decision that would soon seem insane in hindsight. They decided to leave their packs at the junction, all their emergency equipment, their backup gear, their rescue tools. Everything they might need in a crisis was staying behind. After all, it was just a short detour. What could possibly go wrong in 20 minutes? 3 of them decided they had seen enough cave for one day. They volunteered to stay with the packs and wait for the others to return. Dunleavy and 3 other from the group continued into the narrow passage. The passage immediately started to change character. The walls closed in, forcing them to crouch, then crawl. The rock formations became more complex, with loose stones and unstable-looking formations. But they pressed on, driven by the promise of reaching the mysterious Shoemaker Room. They encountered an 18-inch high crawl space that forced them to their bellies. Above them, wedged rocks formed a makeshift ceiling that looked like it had been assembled by some drunk giant. The rocks were clearly not part of the original cave structure. They were breakdown, loose stones that had fallen from above and gotten jammed together. Any experienced spelunker should have recognized the danger immediately. Breakdown formations are notoriously unstable. They shift without warning. They can hold steady for years, then suddenly collapse when disturbed by the slightest vibration. But the lure of exploration overcame caution. One by one, the group squeezed through the 18-inch crawl underneath the wedged rocks. Dunleavy followed the other 3 through the treacherous crawl. The passage was so tight that he had to remove his helmet to fit through. When he finally emerged from the crawl, the discovery waiting for them was crushingly disappointing. The passage ended in a blank wall. There was no Shoemaker Room. There was no grand chamber waiting to be explored. They had risked their lives crawling under unstable rocks for nothing. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. They had made a dangerous journey to reach a dead end. Now they had to make the same dangerous journey back. But this time, they would be traveling in reverse, which is always more difficult and dangerous in tight spaces. As Dunleavy turned to lead his group back through the crawl, he got his first clear look at what they had just traveled under. The full horror of their situation became apparent. The breakdown formation above the crawl was far more unstable than he had realized. Loose rocks were balanced precariously on top of each other, creating a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. They had crawled under what amounted to a loaded gun. The other 3 waited behind him, trapped in the dead-end passage, watching their only escape route with growing anxiety. Dunleavy was halfway through the crawl when physics finally caught up with them. A 50-pound rock, almost 30 kilograms, disturbed by the vibrations of his passage, shifted in the breakdown above. The stone slid down with a grinding sound that echoed through the tight space. It crashed down directly onto Dunleavy's upper legs, pinning him in the narrowest part of the crawl. The impact was devastating. The rock was wedged so tightly that it might as well have been cemented in place. Dunleavy found himself trapped in the worst possible position, lying on his back in an 18-inch space with a 50-pound boulder crushing his legs. He couldn't move forward or backward. He couldn't turn around. He couldn't even sit up. Behind him, the 3 group members trapped in the dead-end passage realized their nightmare had just gotten worse. Not only were they cut off from the outside world, but their only experienced leader was now injured and immobilized. They were trapped behind a human roadblock who might be dying just feet away from them. Dunleavy called back to the trapped team, asking them to try moving the rock. They squeezed forward in the tight space and put their hands on the boulder. It was wedged so tightly between other rocks that it seemed like part of the cave structure itself. No amount of pushing or pulling could budge it even slightly. They quickly realized they needed tools to break the rock or lift it properly. A hammer could shatter it into manageable pieces. Webbing could be wrapped around it to create lifting points. But all their equipment was sitting in their packs on the other side of the crawl, completely unreachable. The irony was maddening. They had all the tools they needed to solve their problem. The decision to leave their packs behind now seemed like the stupidest choice any of them had ever made. Dunleavy managed to call out to the 3 members who had stayed at the junction. The waiting group immediately understood that something had gone terribly wrong. 2 of them immediately left to find Mark Engel and the other group. They ran through the cave passages. The 3rd, named Sky Fisher, stayed behind to try to help the trapped team. But with the crawl blocked by Dunleavy's pinned body, there was almost nothing he could do. The pain was becoming unbearable. Worse, the breakdown formation above him continued to shift and settle. The psychological pressure was almost as bad as the physical pain. Dunleavy knew that he was the key to everyone's survival. If he couldn't get free, the 3 behind him would be trapped indefinitely. After what felt like hours but was only 30 minutes, one of the trapped member of the team had a breakthrough moment. He remembered that he had some rope in his pack. Not the pack they had left at the junction, but a small personal pack he had carried with him into the tight passage. This was the first good news they had received since the rockfall. Fisher was able to reach through a crack in the breakdown and retrieve the rope. It wasn't much, but it was something. It gave them their first real chance to engineer a solution to their problem. The rope opened up new possibilities. Instead of trying to lift the rock with bare hands, they could create a pulley system. Or, instead of pushing against the boulder directly, they could wrap it with rope and pull from better angles. Working in the confined crawl was like performing surgery in a shoebox. Every movement had to be precise and careful. Too much force could shift the breakdown and drop more rocks. Too little force would accomplish nothing. The margin for error was essentially 0. After several attempts and creative problem solving, Dunleavy managed to lift and shift the rock just enough to create a small gap. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the others to work the rope around the boulder. With the rope in place, they finally had the leverage they needed. Working together, they were able to lift the rock just enough for Dunleavy to slide his crushed legs free. The moment he was clear of the boulder, Dunleavy moved faster than he had ever moved in his life. He scrambled out of the crawl space, expecting more rocks to fall at any second. The rest trapped behind him quickly followed, none of them wanting to spend another second under the unstable rocks. They emerged from the crawl space like survivors of a mine collapse, grateful to be alive and swearing never to take such risks again. Mark Engel and the other group arrived just as the crisis was resolving. They found the 4 men shaken but alive, gathered around the junction where their abandoned packs waited. The rescue equipment they had needed so desperately was sitting just a few feet away from where they had almost died. After some rest and medical assessment, the group decided to continue their cave tour. Kevin Dunleavy later wrote in his incident report, "Cavers should never be separated from their packs, but this was only 10 to 20 minutes. We'll be right out. I've heard that many times before, and it bit 4 of us." Those words serve as a warning to every cave explorer who thinks they can bend the rules just this once. The cave is always waiting for that moment of overconfidence. May 5th, 1997. The morning sun barely touched the entrance of Arnold Hollow Cave as 4 explorers prepared for what they thought would be a routine adventure. At 9 a.m., Dell Lancaster, her sister Diane, family friend Phyllis Nelson, and cave owner John Nelson stepped into the darkness, their headlamps cutting through the shadows ahead. John had been excited about this particular expedition for weeks. Deep inside his cave, about 400 yards from the entrance, lay a tight passage that had always frustrated him. Beyond that narrow crawl, he believed, waited a magnificent formation room that no human had ever seen. Today was the day they would finally push through and discover what secrets the cave held. The 4 spelunkers moved through the familiar passages with practiced ease. Dell, 36, had been exploring caves for years. Her older sister Diane, 40, shared the same passion for underground adventures. Phyllis Nelson, despite being 64, moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating the underground world. John Nelson, the cave's owner and their guide, led them deeper into his domain. As they approached the tight spot, the passage narrowed until it became a crawl space barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Dell went first, Diane followed, then Phyllis, each woman working her way through the tight space. John Nelson stood at the entrance to the crawl, studying the opening. As the owner of the cave, he had been through this passage many times before, but it was always a struggle. Described by friends as a rather robust fellow, John found the tight space particularly challenging. Today, however, he had a different plan. Instead of forcing himself through the narrow opening, John decided to make some modifications. He wanted to enlarge the crawl space, not just for his own easier passage, but to make the return trip more comfortable for everyone. It seemed like a logical decision at the time. John began working with his tools, chipping away at the chert and hammering on some loose slabs of breakdown rock. Each strike seemed to bring him closer to his goal of creating a more manageable passage. Then, everything went wrong in an instant. The hammering had loosened more rock than John realized. The cave's delicate balance, maintained for perhaps thousands of years, suddenly shifted. A deep rumble filled the air, followed by the terrifying sound of falling stone. Rocks tumbled down, filling the passage with debris and blocking the opening completely. The three women on the other side of the collapse found themselves plunged into a nightmare scenario. One moment, they were waiting in the larger room beyond the crawl, and the next, they were trapped underground with no way out. The passage that had been their only route to freedom was now sealed by tons of rock and debris. On the other side of the collapse, John Nelson stared at the blocked passage in horror. The reality of what had happened hit him like a physical blow. 3 people were trapped because of his actions. The weight of responsibility crashed down on him as he realized the magnitude of the situation. For the next hour, John worked frantically to clear the blockage. He clawed at the rocks with his bare hands, trying to move stones and debris that would have required heavy machinery to shift. Sweat poured down his face as he fought against the collapse, but the pile of rock remained unmoved. The passage was completely sealed. Finally, John accepted that he couldn't handle this alone. He needed help, and he needed it fast. Leaving the 3 women trapped in the darkness, he made his way out of the cave as quickly as possible. Every step toward the surface felt like a betrayal, but he knew it was their only hope. The moment John emerged from the cave, he began making emergency calls. Local rescue services responded immediately, understanding the critical nature of the situation. Cave rescue experts were contacted and began mobilizing from across the region. Within hours, Arnold Hollow Cave was swarming with emergency personnel. The rescue team's first priority was assessing the situation. Experienced explorers examined the collapse area, studying the pile of rock and debris that sealed the passage. What they found was both encouraging and terrifying. The good news was that the collapse had created a small gap that allowed communication with the trapped women. The bad news was that any attempt to clear the blockage could trigger another collapse, potentially killing everyone involved. The women trapped beyond the collapse found themselves in a nightmare scenario. Dell, Diane, and Phyllis were squeezed into a cramped space barely large enough for the 3 of them to stand together. They had to remain pressed against each other, unable to sit or lie down comfortably. The walls seemed to close in around them as they struggled to find positions that didn't cause immediate discomfort. They weren't injured, and they had enough air to breathe, but the confined space made every minute feel like an eternity. They were completely cut off from the outside world, dependent entirely on the rescue efforts above. The rescue team made a crucial decision. They would not attempt to clear the collapse until they had properly shored up the passage. Moving rocks without proper support could cause the entire area to collapse further, potentially crushing the trapped women or making the situation impossible to resolve. Through the small gap in the debris, rescuers were able to pass essential supplies to the women. Food, water, warm clothing, and even a small camping stove made their way through the opening. These supplies were literally lifelines, helping prevent hypothermia and maintaining the women's strength for what everyone knew would be a long ordeal. As word spread about the rescue operation, help arrived from unexpected sources. Personnel from a nearby silica mine heard about the situation and offered their expertise. These workers understood rock formations and had experience with the tools and techniques needed for this type of operation. The mine workers joined the others in the painstaking process of cutting timbers and installing proper shoring in the passage. Every piece of wood had to be carefully positioned to provide maximum support, while still allowing access to the collapse area. The work was slow and methodical, with safety being the top priority throughout. Hours passed as the rescue operation continued. Above ground, family members and friends gathered, waiting for news. The tension was unbearable as everyone wondered whether the three women would make it out alive. Underground, the rescue team worked steadily, knowing that every minute counted. As the day wore on, the trapped women maintained their composure on the surface, but the reality of their situation was far more terrifying than they let on. Standing together in their cramped prison, they tried to stay calm and rational, but fear gnawed at them constantly. Finally, as evening approached, the rescue team felt confident enough to begin moving rocks. With the passage properly shored up, they started the delicate process of clearing the collapse. Each stone was carefully removed, with constant attention to the stability of the surrounding rock. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Rescuers had to crawl into tight spaces, working in cramped conditions while constantly watching for signs of further collapse. Every rock that came free brought them closer to reopening the passage, but also increased the risk of triggering another cave-in. As the clock approached 8:30 p.m., more than 11 hours after the collapse, the rescue team finally broke through. The passage was open again, creating a route to freedom for the three trapped women. The moment was met with cheers from the rescue team and tears of relief from the waiting families. Dell, Diane, and Phyllis emerged from the cave in remarkably good spirits, considering their ordeal. Despite spending over 11 hours trapped in a cramped space, they had maintained their composure throughout the day and were in good physical condition. The supplies passed through the gap had prevented hypothermia, and their ability to support each other had carried them through the crisis. However, once they were safely above ground and the initial relief had passed, the three women began to open up about their true feelings during the entrapment. Dell broke down as she described the moments when she thought they might never get out alive. Diane admitted that she had been terrified, but didn't want to scare the others by showing her fear. Phyllis, the most experienced among them, revealed that this had been the most frightening experience of her life. In the aftermath of the rescue, experts analyzed what had gone wrong and what had gone right. The collapse had been caused by well-intentioned but dangerous modification of the cave passage. The lesson was clear. Never attempt to alter cave passages when people are deeper in the cave, as the consequences can be catastrophic. It was late afternoon of April 19th, 2012, in Cenote Chak Mool, as tourists began packing up their gear for the day. Located in the heart of Quintana Roo, Mexico, this popular diving spot has welcomed countless visitors, seeking to explore its crystal-clear underwater caverns. But as closing time approached, three people were about to make a decision that would turn their dream vacation into a nightmare. Carlos had been guiding divers at Cenote Chak Mool for 2 years. At 28, he was confident in his abilities and knew every twist and turn of the cavern system. He had performed hundreds of cavern dives, always staying within the safe zone where natural light could still penetrate the water. But Carlos had a secret that his clients never knew about. He wasn't certified to lead cave diving trips into the deeper, darker parts of the cenote system. That afternoon, as the cenote prepared to close for the day, Carlos met his latest clients. Marina and Eduardo were a young Brazilian couple on their honeymoon, still glowing with the excitement of newlyweds. They had saved for months to afford this trip to Mexico's Riviera Maya, and cave diving was at the top of their bucket list. Eduardo, 26, and Marina, 24, were newer to the sport but eager to experience the underwater world that had captivated them. The couple had booked their dive for later in the day, hoping to avoid the crowds that typically gathered at the popular cenote during peak hours. They arrived just 1 hour before closing time, their excitement barely contained as they suited up in their gear. As they prepared their equipment, Carlos made a decision that would haunt the diving community for years to come. He had been in the cavern system earlier that day and had noticed something interesting deeper in the cave zone. There was a section he had explored before, well beyond the safe cavern area, where the rock formations were particularly stunning. The three divers entered the water as the cenote staff began their closing procedures. Other divers were already heading back to the surface, their day of exploration complete. Carlos led Marina and Eduardo through the initial underwater passages, pointing out the stalactites and limestone formations that made cenotes so popular with divers worldwide. The water was perfectly clear, visibility extending for dozens of meters in every direction. Schools of small fish darted between the rock formations, while shafts of sunlight created an almost cathedral-like atmosphere underwater. Marina swam close to Eduardo, her eyes wide with wonder behind her diving mask. This was exactly what they had dreamed their honeymoon would be like. As they swam deeper into the cenote, Carlos began leading them away from the designated cavern zone. The natural light from the surface grew dimmer, but the couple trusted their guide completely. They had no way of knowing that they were entering an area that required advanced cave diving certification and specialized equipment. The transition from cavern to cave happened gradually. The overhead openings to the surface became fewer and smaller until they disappeared entirely. They were now in the dark zone, a place where only experienced cave divers should venture. Carlos had dive lights, but he underestimated how quickly the situation could become dangerous. About 80 meters, 262 feet, from the surface, roughly an 8-minute swim in ideal conditions, Carlos began to realize his mistake. The passage ahead split into multiple tunnels, and he wasn't entirely sure which route would lead them back to the cavern zone. The rock formations that had seemed so beautiful moments before now appeared menacing in the beam of his dive light. Marina was the first to show signs of distress. Cave diving requires special techniques and mental preparation that cavern divers don't typically possess. The overhead environment, with no direct route to the surface, began to trigger anxiety. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, consuming her air supply much faster than normal. Eduardo noticed his wife's distress and tried to signal to Carlos, but the guide was focused on finding the correct passage back to safety. The dive line that should have marked their route was visible just a few feet away, but in the darkness and confusion, Carlos missed its significance. As Marina's air supply dwindled, panic began to set in. She tried to swim upward, looking for a way to the surface, but found only solid rock overhead. The realization that she was trapped underground, with no direct route to air, overwhelmed her completely. Her movements became erratic and desperate. Eduardo, seeing his wife in distress, made the fatal decision to share his air with her. In open water, this might have been possible, but the stress and confusion of the cave environment made it nearly impossible to execute safely. Both newlyweds were now consuming Eduardo's air supply at a dangerous rate. Carlos finally realized the severity of the situation, but it was too late. Marina had already inhaled water as her air supply ran out completely. Eduardo, trying desperately to save his wife, had exhausted his own air attempting to get her to the surface. The guide, watching his clients die before his eyes, made frantic efforts to get them back to safety. But the distance to the cavern zone was too great. In the darkness of the cave, with no natural light to guide them, all three divers became disoriented. Eduardo still had some air remaining in his tank, but it had been too little, too late to save anyone. Above the surface, the cenote had officially closed for the day. Staff members noticed that Carlos and his clients hadn't returned, but several hours passed before anyone became seriously concerned. It wasn't unusual for guides to take their time with clients, and the assumption was that they were simply taking a longer route or making additional stops. As the evening wore on and there was still no sign of the three divers, concern grew into alarm. Emergency services were finally notified, and a search and rescue operation began. Cave diving rescue teams were called in from across the region, understanding that time was critical in any underwater emergency. The search teams entered the water with powerful lights and specialized equipment, following the most likely routes that a cavern dive might have taken. They checked the designated cavern areas first, then expanded their search into the cave zone when no trace of the missing divers was found. Shortly before 2 a.m. on April 20th, the search teams made the tragic discovery. The three bodies were found deep in the cave zone, far beyond where any cavern dive should have ventured. The positioning of the bodies told a story of confusion and panic, with all three divers facing away from the exit, lost in the darkness. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of the tragedy. Carlos, despite his experience in the cenote, was not certified to lead cave diving trips. His clients Marina and Eduardo were qualified only for cavern diving and had no training for the overhead environment they had entered. The combination of an unqualified guide and inadequately trained divers had created a deadly situation. The diving community was shocked by the incident, particularly because it highlighted a known problem at Cenote Chak Mool. Local cavern dive guides had been reported to frequently venture into the cave zone, often having to be warned or chased out by properly certified cave divers. The pressure to provide clients with unique experiences had led to dangerous risk-taking. Marina and Eduardo's families were devastated by the loss. The young couple had been married only months before, with their whole lives ahead of them. Their dream honeymoon had turned into an unimaginable tragedy that would forever change their families' lives. On January 25, 1986, 4 cave explorers gathered for a caving expedition that they were planning for a very long time. Parker's Pit Cave draws experienced spelunkers from across the Midwest, with its technical challenges and deep vertical drops. The cave system requires advanced rappelling skills and specialized equipment to navigate safely. Unlike horizontal caves where one can walk or crawl through passages, vertical caves like Parker's Pit demand absolute precision in rope work and equipment rigging. On that January morning, the 4 arrived at the cave entrance, equipped with what they believed was the proper gear for the challenging descent ahead. The group included experienced cave explorers who had tackled similar vertical systems before, but experience means nothing when basic safety procedures are abandoned. The team prepared to descend into the depths of Parker's Pit. Their first major obstacle was the upper bound, a vertical drop of 22 feet, 6.7 meters. That required careful rappelling technique to navigate safely. The upper bound represented a deadly hazard waiting to claim its next victim. A fall from 22 feet, 6.7 meters, onto solid limestone could shatter bones, crush skulls, and snap spines like twigs. 2 of them successfully completed their descent down the upper bound, using proper rappelling technique and safety equipment. They reached the bottom of the pit safely and prepared to continue deeper into the cave system, unaware of the disaster that was about to unfold above them. The 3rd began his descent, but he had made a critical and potentially fatal error in rigging his rappelling equipment. He was using a carabiner brake bar device, a common piece of caving equipment designed to control the speed of descent down a rope. When properly rigged, this device allows to descend smoothly and safely, with complete control over their rate of descent. However, proper rigging requires the rope to follow a specific path through the carabiner and around the brake bar. The rope must pass through the carabiner, over the brake bar, and then back down through the carabiner again. This configuration creates the friction needed to control the descent and prevent a dangerous free fall. Unfortunately, the 3rd in line catastrophically failed to complete this rigging sequence. His rope went through the carabiner and over the brake bar, but he had neglected the crucial final step of threading it back down through the carabiner. This incomplete rigging meant that his brake bar device was essentially useless, providing no friction or control over his descent. The deadly trap was set. Death waited 22 feet, 6.7 meters below on the limestone floor. As he stepped off the edge to begin his rappel, the improperly rigged equipment immediately failed to provide any braking action. The rope slipped freely through his device, and he realized with pure terror that he was falling. The cave walls rushed past him in a blur as he plummeted through the darkness with a sickening whoosh of displaced air. Gravity seized his body and accelerated him downward at an ever-increasing speed, while the others watched helplessly in absolute horror. His body struck the limestone floor with a loud impact. The rest of the team was ready to find their companion's broken body sprawled on the limestone, and they rushed towards him. When the other reached the impact site, they discovered something that defied all logic and expectation. The fallen cave explorer was conscious and moving. Somehow, impossibly, he had survived the catastrophic fall that should have ended his life. By some impossible stroke of fortune, he had survived what should have been a fatal accident. He struggled to his feet, shaken but apparently uninjured. His survival was nothing short of miraculous. However, the psychological trauma was immediate and severe. His hands shook uncontrollably as the reality of what had happened sank in. He had just experienced his own near death and was not in the right mental frame to continue. At that point, the wise decision would have been to head back. However, in a decision that bordered on insanity, the group chose to continue deeper into Parker's pit rather than immediately evacuating to seek medical attention. The spelunker, who had just survived what should have been a fatal fall, insisted he was fine and wanted to continue with the planned exploration. This decision demonstrated the dangerous mindset that kills cavers, the belief that surviving one close call means you are invincible. They descended deeper into the cave system, where the passages became more technical and the dangers multiplied. The cave system's most notorious feature awaited them deeper underground, a passage known as the Z-Bend. This formation is no less than a nightmare, a series of tight constrictions that forced explorers to contort their bodies through spaces barely large enough for human passage. The Z-Bend had earned its fearsome reputation by trapping people in positions where they could neither advance nor retreat. The first one entered feet first and on his belly. He wriggled his way through the passage and moved towards the first sharp bend. As he did so, he warned others about how tight it was. The second one in the group followed behind. He also went feet first, however. He went in lying on his back. When he entered the Z-Bend, he immediately encountered the passage's deadly nature. The limestone walls seemed to grip his body, holding him in place as he tried to work his way through the constricted space. With each movement, the rock seemed to tighten its grip, compressing his chest and making breathing increasingly difficult. Within moments, just at the first sharp turn, he realized he was trapped. The limestone had him in its deadly embrace, and panic began to set in as he discovered he could neither move forward nor backward through the constricted passage. His situation quickly became life-threatening. The Z-Bend compressed his chest, making each breath a struggle against the crushing pressure of solid rock. Panic made the situation worse. As his muscles tensed with fear, his body expanded slightly, making the already impossibly tight passage even more constricting. The stone walls that had seemed merely tight now felt like they were actively trying to crush the life from his body. The others could hear him cry for help. Time was running out. If they could not extract him quickly, the Z-Bend would claim another victim. The rescue attempt began immediately, but the confined space of the Z-Bend made every movement dangerous for both the victim and his would-be rescuers. One of them positioned himself behind the trapped man, while the other worked from ahead, both risking their own entrapment in the deadly passage. The limestone seemed to fight their every effort. Each attempt to shift the trapped man's position met resistance from the unyielding rock walls. The rescuers themselves were forced into awkward, uncomfortable positions that threatened to trap them as well in the stone maze. The trapped victim's breathing grew more labored with each passing minute as the rock continued to compress his chest. His face was pale and drawn as oxygen deprivation began to take its toll. Inch by agonizing inch, they worked the trapped guy through the deadly passage. Every small movement was a victory against the limestone that seemed determined to claim another victim. The rock scraped against flesh and tore at clothing as they forced their way through spaces that seemed too small for human passage. Their trapped friend's strength was almost gone when they finally managed to work him through the worst of the constriction. His body slipped through the narrowest point of the Z-Bend just as his endurance reached its limit. A few more minutes, and the passage would have claimed his life through exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. The successful extraction marked the end of what had become a nightmare expedition into Parker's pit. Two potentially fatal incidents in a single caving trip represented an extraordinary concentration of deadly encounters that should have left at least one of them dead. The group finally began their retreat from the cave system, climbing back up the same passages that had nearly claimed 2 lives. The psychological toll of the day's events was evident in all 4 of them as they made their way back to the surface. The easy camaraderie of the morning had been replaced by the haunted expressions of people who had looked death in the face and somehow lived to tell about it. On May 24th, 1987, 4 friends drove to Lava Beds National Monument, just south of Klamath Falls, Oregon, with plans to explore the area's famous cave systems. Kevin Smith and his brother Mike were experienced cavers who had been exploring underground passages for over a year. They were joined by Kevin Atkinson, 16 years old, and John Adams, who at 14 was the youngest member of the group. The monument encourages cave exploration, with numerous ungated lava caves open to both tourists and serious cavers. Unlike many cave systems that require special permits or guided tours, lava beds allows visitors to explore on their own, though they must sign in at trail registers before entering certain areas. The group arrived at the Skull Cave parking lot around 10 a.m. on that Sunday morning. Skull Cave was one of the monument's most popular destinations, a large lava tube that extends deep into the volcanic rock. The cave's name comes from the animal bones found at its entrance, remnants of creatures that fell into the opening and could not escape. The group split up to explore different areas. Kevin and Mike Smith decided to enter Skull Cave itself, while Atkinson and Adams chose to investigate a collapse hole located a short distance from the Wilderness Trail, just beyond the trail register. The collapse hole that caught Atkinson and Adams' attention was typical of the volcanic landscape. When lava tubes cool and age, sections of the ceiling sometimes fall in, creating openings to the surface and piles of broken rock called breakdown. These areas can be fascinating to explore, but they are also inherently unstable. Around 10 a.m., Kevin Atkinson discovered what appeared to be an opening leading down into the pile of volcanic rock. The hole seemed to lead to a small chamber below the breakdown. Despite the obvious instability of the loose rocks around him, Atkinson decided to climb down through the opening to explore the chamber below. John Adams remained at the surface level, clambering around the edges of the collapse hole and examining the rock formations. The 14-year-old was fascinated by the volcanic landscape and moved carefully among the loose stones, unaware of the danger building beneath his feet. The volcanic rock in breakdown piles creates a delicate balance. Each piece of stone may be supporting others above it, creating an unstable house of cards that can collapse without warning. Even rocks that seem solid can shift when disturbed, causing a cascade of falling stone that can trap or crush anyone below. As Adams moved around the hole, the pressure and vibration from his movements began to affect the already unstable rock pile. The sides of the collapse started to shift and crumble. Within moments, the breakdown gave way in a thunderous cascade of volcanic stone. The rockfall happened with terrifying speed. Chunks of lava rock, some weighing hundreds of pounds, tumbled into the hole where Atkinson was exploring. Adams, caught on the walls of the hole leading to the chamber when the sides gave way, was also trapped as rocks fell around and on top of him. In an instant, both teenagers found themselves buried under tons of volcanic stone. Atkinson was trapped in the small chamber below, with rocks blocking his escape route to the surface. Adams was buried some distance below the surface level, with heavy stones pinning his body and limiting his movement. The collapse created a deadly situation. Not only were both boys trapped and potentially injured, but any attempt to move the rocks could trigger another collapse, burying them deeper or crushing them completely. The breakdown pile was now even more unstable than before, with loose rocks balanced precariously above the trapped teenagers. From beneath the pile of stone, the boys began calling for help. Their voices echoed strangely through the spaces between the rocks, making it difficult to determine exactly where they were located. Atkinson reported numbness in his extremities, suggesting possible nerve damage or a crushed leg. Adams was conscious but in shock, trapped and unable to move under the weight of the volcanic rock. Kevin and Mike Smith emerged from Skull Cave to find their companions missing. They walked to the trail register, expecting to find Atkinson and Adams waiting for them or signing in for their own cave exploration. Instead, they heard yelling coming from the direction of the collapse hole. Rushing to the source of the voices, the Smith brothers quickly realized what had happened. They could hear their friends calling from beneath the pile of rocks, but the extent of the collapse made it clear that this was far beyond anything they could handle on their own. Kevin Smith immediately ran for the visitor center at Indian Wells headquarters. At 10:20 a.m., just 20 minutes after the collapse, he reported the incident to park personnel. His quick thinking and rapid response would prove crucial in organizing the complex rescue operation that followed. Park Service personnel responded immediately to the emergency. When they arrived at the collapse site, they quickly assessed the situation. 2 teenagers trapped under tons of unstable volcanic rock, with at least one reporting possible serious injury. It was clear that this would require a major rescue operation involving specialized equipment and personnel. The Park Service requested assistance from multiple agencies. The California Highway Patrol and Sheriff's Office were contacted, along with an ambulance and fire engine from the nearby town of Tula Lake. By fortunate coincidence, 4 well-equipped spelunkers from the San Francisco Bay chapter of the National Speleological Society were visiting the monument that day. These experienced cave explorers immediately volunteered their assistance and expertise, providing crucial knowledge about cave rescue techniques and rock stabilization. At 10:45 a.m., just 25 minutes after the initial report, a helicopter was requested in case rapid medical evacuation became necessary. The nearest available aircraft was a California Department of Forestry helicopter stationed in Bieber. The aircraft, designated CDF Copter 202, was dispatched immediately to the scene. As rescue personnel began arriving at lava beds, the complexity of the operation became clear. They had to first rescue Atkinson since he was trapped in a chamber under the breakdown. Any instability or breakdowns while rescuing Adam could create a fatal situation for Atkinson. The Skull Cave parking lot was cleared of all vehicles to create a landing zone for the incoming helicopter. Every car had to be moved to make room for the aircraft that might be needed to transport critically injured victims to medical facilities. CDF Copter 202 arrived at 11:30 a.m., bringing additional medical personnel to the scene. An emergency medical technician from the helicopter crew positioned herself near the collapse site, where she could communicate directly with John Adams. Her primary role was to keep the trapped teenager's morale up and monitor his condition while the rescue operation proceeded. Moving the rocks that trapped Atkinson and Adams required extreme care and considerable risk. Each stone had to be evaluated before being moved, as shifting the wrong rock could trigger another collapse that would bury the victims deeper or trap the rescuers as well. Park Service personnel placed themselves in extremely hazardous positions to stabilize the collapse area. The walls of the hole were braced with wooden supports to prevent further cave-ins. One rescuer climbed down into the unstable breakdown pile to take precise measurements of the spaces between rocks and the positioning of the trapped teenagers. The measurements were passed up to personnel on the surface, who used chainsaws to cut wooden braces to the exact required lengths. These supports were then passed back down into the hole and hammered into place to hold back the loose rock. Hydraulic jacks were also used to create stable spaces where rescuers could work safely. The process was painstakingly slow. Every movement had to be calculated and deliberate. The volcanic rock was sharp and difficult to handle, and the constant threat of another collapse made every action potentially life-threatening for both the victims and their rescuers. As the walls were gradually stabilized, rescuers were able to bring in a porta-power hydraulic device to move the larger rocks that were directly trapping the teenagers. This powerful tool could lift stones that were too heavy for human strength alone, but it had to be positioned carefully to avoid destabilizing other parts of the breakdown pile. After nearly 3 hours of careful, dangerous work, rescuers achieved their first success. At 12:55 p.m., Kevin Atkinson was freed from the rocks that had trapped him in the small chamber below ground. He had been buried for almost 3 hours, but his injuries were less severe than initially feared. Atkinson appeared to be suffering from shock, which was expected given his ordeal, but examination revealed only minor abrasions and cuts from the sharp volcanic rock. There were no broken bones or signs of the serious leg injury that had been feared based on his reports of numbness. The 16-year-old was immediately placed on a backboard and carefully removed from the unstable collapse area. At 1 p.m., just 5 minutes after being freed, he was loaded onto CDF Copter 202 and flown to Merle West Medical Center in Klamath Falls, Oregon, for comprehensive medical evaluation and treatment. Even with Atkinson safely rescued, the operation remained extremely dangerous. John Adams was still trapped under the rocks, and the rescue work had made the breakdown pile even more unstable. Every rock that had been moved had potentially shifted the balance of the remaining stones. At 1:15 p.m., Lassen County rescue personnel were placed on standby in case the collapse area gave way again and trapped some of the rescuers. The rescuers were working in conditions where a single wrong move could bury them alongside the victim they were trying to save. The decision to continue the rescue despite the increasing danger demonstrated the commitment of the Park Service personnel and other rescuers. They could have waited for additional equipment or tried to approach the problem differently, but Adams had already been trapped for over 3 hours, and delay could prove fatal. The methodical work continued, with rescuers carefully removing rocks and stabilizing the breakdown pile piece by piece. The Porta-Power hydraulic device proved essential in moving the heaviest stones that were pinning Adams to the ground. At 2 p.m., nearly 4 hours after the initial collapse, John Adams was finally freed from the volcanic rock that had trapped him. Like Atkinson, the 14-year-old was suffering from shock but had avoided serious injury. Adams was immediately placed on a backboard and removed from the dangerous collapse area. He was then loaded onto the waiting helicopter and flown to the same medical facility in Klamath Falls where Atkinson was being treated. Both teenagers would make full recoveries from their ordeal. It was late Saturday evening, October 1st, 1983, when 6 experienced cave explorers made their way into the depths of Dreeblebis Cave, located near the quiet town of Kutztown in Berks County, Pennsylvania. These weren't amateur explorers. They were seasoned spelunkers who knew the underground world intimately. The cave system they entered that evening was familiar territory, a place they had likely explored before without incident. For hours, the group navigated the underground passages and they made their way deeper into the earth. Everything proceeded normally until the early morning hours when the group decided it was time to head back to the surface. They began their exit around 2 a.m. with 36-year-old Robert E. Scott bringing up the rear of the group. Scott found himself approximately 75 feet, 23 meters, from the cave entrance, working his way through what appeared to be a manageable vertical crevice. He was third in line. 2 had already made their way successfully. This particular passage was a narrow slot in the rock, stretching about 80 feet, 24 meters high, and generally 12 inches wide. But like many cave formations, this crevice had a cruel trick waiting in its middle section. It narrowed dramatically to just 7 or 8 inches before opening up again below. As Scott maneuvered through this tight section, disaster struck in an instant. His hand slipped on the wet rock surface. In cave environments, surfaces are often coated with a thin layer of mud and moisture that makes them treacherously slippery. Without warning, his body dropped down into the narrowest part of the crevice. In that split second, Robert Scott's world changed forever. He found himself wedged tightly in the middle portion of the crevice, trapped on his left side. The rock walls pressed against his body from both sides, and every surface around him was rounded and slick with mud. There was nothing to grab onto, no way to gain purchase or leverage. The very geological features that had formed this cave over thousands of years had created the perfect trap. Scott's companions immediately realized something was wrong when they lost contact with him. They quickly discovered his predicament. These were experienced explorers themselves, people who understood the underground environment and had likely dealt with tight spots before. But this situation was different. No matter what they tried, they couldn't get Scott free. As the hours passed, it became clear that this was beyond what the group could handle alone. They had tried everything from their experience, but the cave's grip was far more stronger than what they had imagined. At 9:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, after 8 grueling hours of failed attempts, they made the difficult decision to leave Scott behind and go for outside help. Imagine the agonizing choice they faced, leaving their friend trapped in that narrow crevice while they sought assistance from the surface. The ones above Scott made their way through another exit, joining the 2 who made their way outside before. Word spread quickly through the local emergency response network. Volunteers from 4 different fire departments descended on the cave site, bringing with them equipment and determination. These were brave men and women who regularly risked their lives to save others, but cave rescue presented unique challenges that most of them had never faced before. The complexity of the situation soon became apparent. This wasn't a simple matter of pulling someone out of a hole. The victim was wedged deep underground in a space so narrow that rescuers could barely access him, let alone work effectively around him. Recognizing that specialized expertise was needed, authorities contacted the National Cave Rescue Commission. By late Sunday afternoon, 14 highly trained cave rescue specialists were flown in from Pittsburgh. These were the elite of cave rescue, people who had spent years training for exactly this type of emergency. They brought with them specialized equipment and techniques developed specifically for underground rescue operations. When the NCRC team first established contact with Scott, he was described as being in good spirits. After being trapped for over 12 hours, he was still alert and communicating normally with his rescuers. There was reason for cautious optimism, but as Sunday wore on, something began to change in Scott's demeanor. The psychological pressure of being trapped in such a confined space for an extended period began to take its toll. Scott's mood deteriorated rapidly, and he became increasingly irrational and abusive toward the very people trying to save his life. This wasn't simply fear or frustration. His behavior suggested something more serious was happening. The rescue team learned that Scott was epileptic, a medical condition that added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Twice during the rescue attempt, he was given medication to prevent seizures. However, this treatment did nothing to improve his mental state or cooperative behavior. The technical aspects of the rescue were as challenging as they were innovative. Rescuers strung a high line through the passage above Scott and placed slings around his body, attempting to lift him vertically out of the trap. Every time they made even the slightest progress, disaster would strike. Scott would begin thrashing wildly, his violent movements defeating any progress they had made and potentially making his situation worse. Understanding that this would be a long-term operation, the rescue team established a sophisticated support system. They set up monitoring equipment outside the cave and attached sensors to Scott so they could continuously track his vital signs. Keeping him warm became a critical priority. Cave temperatures remain constant year-round, typically in the 50s. Fahrenheit, 10 to 15 Celsius, which can lead to hypothermia during extended exposure. The methods they used to maintain Scott's body temperature were both ingenious and desperate. Heat packs were positioned around him. High-intensity lights were directed at his location, not just for illumination, but for their heat output. Most remarkably, they ran extension cords deep into the cave and used hair dryers, blowing warm air up through Scott's pant legs and sleeves to circulate heat around his body. Despite being trapped in an impossible situation, Scott was able to eat and drink. Throughout the ordeal, rescuers managed to get coffee, broth, hot dogs, and donuts to him. The fact that he could consume food and liquids was seen as a positive sign. It meant his body was still functioning normally, and he had the strength to continue fighting. But Scott's increasingly erratic behavior was becoming the biggest obstacle to his own rescue. As the hours passed, he screamed abuse at the very people risking their lives to save him. The rescue team found themselves in an impossible situation. Their patient was actively working against his own salvation. The medical team on site recognized that sedation might be the key to a successful rescue. If they could calm Scott down, stop his thrashing movements, they might be able to extract him safely. However, the doctors directing the paramedics refused to authorize the use of tranquilizers or sedatives. This decision would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire rescue operation. Desperate to find a medical authority who would approve sedation, the rescue team attempted something unprecedented. They tried to patch into a local phone line to make a long-distance call to a doctor in California who was also an experienced spelunker. They hoped this physician would understand the unique circumstances and provide the medical authorization they needed. Meanwhile, the technical rescue efforts continued around the clock. Rescuers positioned inflatable airbags underneath Scott, hoping that when inflated, they would provide enough lift to raise him out of the narrow section. They covered his body with grease to reduce friction against the rock walls. They lined the walls themselves with plastic sheeting to create a smoother surface. Nothing worked. The crevice that held Scott prisoner seemed designed by nature to prevent exactly what the rescuers were trying to accomplish. Every technique that might work in other confined space rescues was defeated by the unique geometry of this underground trap. As Monday morning approached, Scott had been trapped for over 24 hours. Around 7 a.m. on Monday morning, as Scott delivered yet another tantrum, screaming at his rescuers, something catastrophic happened. His vital signs suddenly ceased. The monitoring equipment that had been tracking his heart rate and other life signs went flat. Scott lost consciousness, his body finally succumbing to the incredible stress he had endured for more than a day. The rescue team immediately began emergency medical procedures. Oxygen was administered directly to Scott. Heated intravenous fluids were pushed into his system in an attempt to restore his vital signs and bring him back to consciousness. But nothing worked. After 29 hours underground, Robert Scott's body had reached the limits of what it could endure. With their patient unconscious and no longer able to thrash and fight against rescue efforts, the team made the difficult decision to use what they called painful extraction methods. They no longer had to worry about causing Scott discomfort or injury. Saving his life was the only priority that mattered. Using the high line strung above the victim and the slings positioned around his body, they began dragging Scott upward through the narrow crevice. It was a brutal process, one that would have caused significant pain and injury if he had been conscious, but it was now their only option. At 12:25 p.m. on Monday, October 3rd, Robert Scott was finally freed from the crevice that had held him prisoner for over 30 hours. The rescue team worked frantically, hoping against hope that he had simply lapsed into deep hypothermia, a condition from which people can sometimes be revived even after extended periods without vital signs. But their hopes were unfounded. Shortly after his extraction, Robert E. Scott was pronounced dead. The 36-year-old man, who had entered the cave as part of a routine Saturday evening adventure, had become the victim of one of Pennsylvania's most tragic cave rescue attempts. The coroner's report revealed the medical reality of what had killed Scott. The official cause of death was listed as congestive heart failure due to irreversible shock. More specifically, he had suffered a heart attack brought on by the incredible physical stress and pressure on his chest after 29 hours underground. The combination of cold, fear, and physical compression had pushed his cardiovascular system beyond its limits. Importantly, the coroner determined that Scott's epilepsy was not a factor in his death. April 24, 2001, was the day when one of the most heartbreaking tragedies took place. 47-year-old Margaret Chen thought it would be just another peaceful evening walk with her 2 golden retriever puppies on the big island of Hawaii. She had moved to the island 3 years earlier, drawn by the stunning volcanic landscape and the promise of a quieter life. The puppies, Max and Luna, were barely 6 months old, energetic bundles of fur who brought joy to her days and helped fill the loneliness that had followed her divorce. Margaret had walked this path dozens of times over the past year. The area was riddled with lava tubes. Underground tunnels formed when molten rock had flowed beneath the surface centuries ago. Most of the openings were small and obvious, easy to spot and avoid. The Park Service had warned residents about them, but Margaret had always been careful. The puppies were particularly playful that evening. They chased each other in circles, wrestled on the smooth lava rock, and explored every interesting scent they encountered. Margaret smiled as she watched them, remembering why she had gotten them in the first place. After 23 years of marriage had ended in heartbreak, these 2 little lives had given her purpose again. As they reached the halfway point of their usual route, the puppies suddenly bolted. There was no warning, no obvious trigger. One moment they were walking calmly beside her, the next they were racing away across the lava field. Margaret called after them, confused by their sudden burst of energy. But they were already disappearing behind a ridge of volcanic rock. She wasn't worried at first. The puppies often wandered off for a few minutes before returning, tongues hanging out and tails wagging. But as she followed their path, calling their names, a strange disorientation crept over her. The familiar landscape looked different in the fading light. Minutes turned into an hour. Margaret's casual calling became more urgent. She climbed over rock formations she had never explored before, searching every crevice and shadow. The puppies' golden fur should have been easy to spot, but there was no sign of them anywhere. As darkness began to fall, real fear crept into her heart. The lava field was dangerous at night. Sharp rocks, hidden crevices, and those treacherous lava tube openings made navigation deadly without proper light. She had only a small flashlight, meant for emergencies, not for a major search operation. Margaret's voice grew hoarse from calling. She had covered nearly a mile in every direction from where she last saw them. The beam of her flashlight seemed pathetically small against the vast expanse of black rock. Every shadow looked like a puppy. Every rock formation seemed to hide a possible answer. Then she heard it. Faint whimpering, so soft she almost missed it. She stopped walking and listened with every fiber of her being. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of a puppy in distress. The sound seemed to be coming from below, somewhere beneath her feet. Margaret followed the sound, moving carefully across the uneven surface. The whimpering grew slightly louder, leading her to a section of the lava field she had never explored before. Here, there were holes and pits with rock formations that were different, more broken and irregular. The crying was definitely coming from one of these openings. Margaret moved from hole to hole, calling down into the darkness. Most were shallow, just dips in the rock surface. But one was different. When she called into it, her voice echoed back strangely, suggesting a much deeper cavity. She aimed her flashlight down into the opening. The beam disappeared into what looked like a narrow tunnel, and there, about 15 feet down, roughly 4.5 meters, she could see two small golden shapes huddled together on a ledge. Max and Luna were alive, but they were trapped. The lava tube opening was only about 2 feet wide, just 23 inches across. Too narrow for Margaret to fit through, but somehow the puppies had managed to fall in. They must have been exploring when the ground gave way beneath them. Now they were stuck on the bottom of a narrow pit, scared and unable to climb back up the smooth walls. Margaret's heart broke as she looked down at them. Luna, the smaller of the two, appeared to be limping. Max was pressed against her, both of them huddling together. She tried everything she could think of. She called 911, but her cell phone had no signal in this remote area. She tried lowering her belt down to them, but it wasn't nearly long enough. She even attempted to climb down herself, but the opening was too narrow and the walls too smooth. The puppies' cries grew weaker as the night wore on. They were getting tired, probably thirsty, and definitely scared. Margaret refused to leave them. She lay on her stomach next to the opening, talking to them in soothing tones, trying to keep them calm while she figured out what to do. Dawn was still hours away. Help was miles away. The puppies needed her now. Margaret made a decision that would cost her everything. She remembered seeing a longer piece of rope in her garage. If she could somehow get closer to the opening, maybe she could lower it down far enough for the puppies to grab onto. The walls of the lava tube were smooth, but there might be enough texture for her to find handholds. She positioned herself over the opening, feet first, and began to lower herself down. At first it seemed like it might work, but the walls were smoother than they looked, and the opening was narrower than she had estimated. Margaret slipped. In an instant, she was falling headfirst into the lava tube. The narrow opening that had trapped her puppies now trapped her as well. But unlike the puppies, who had landed on a ledge, Margaret became wedged in the tube itself, her body stuck upside down. The irony was heartbreaking. She was now close enough to touch her puppies, but she couldn't help them. She couldn't help herself. Her waist and entire upper body were pinned by the narrow walls. Hours passed. Margaret's calls for help grew weaker. She was desperate, but was close enough to pet her puppies. She struggled to move, but somehow was glad that she was near them. The puppies, sensing their human's distress, whimpered softly. They were all trapped now, all of them victims of love and desperation. Luckily, a few hikers were passing nearby, and they found them the next morning and called for help. Margaret was barely conscious. The fire department arrived quickly, but what they found was devastating. Margaret was wedged upside down in the narrow tube, her face flushed dark red from the blood pooling in her head. She could barely speak, her voice a whisper. Through cracked lips, she managed to tell them what happened, how she heard the puppies crying, how she tried to reach them, how she slipped and became trapped. Her words came in fragments, exhausted and drained from the ordeal. The rescue workers immediately began trying to extract her, but the narrow opening made it nearly impossible. Every minute that passed made her condition worse. Being trapped upside down was slowly killing her. The blood pooling in her head was putting enormous pressure on her brain and heart. Hours passed as they worked desperately to free her. They brought in specialized equipment, consulted with experts, and tried every technique they knew. But Margaret's body was shutting down. The sustained pressure on her cardiovascular system was too much. Her heart, already stressed from hours of fighting gravity, began to fail. Luna's eyes stared at her, filled with confusion and fear. The puppy's soft whimpers cut deeper than Margaret's physical pain. The medical team on scene could see the signs. Her pulse was becoming irregular. Her blood pressure was dropping. The lack of proper circulation was causing organ failure. Even if they could extract her immediately, the damage might already be irreversible. Her puppies could only watch. They saw Margaret up close, suffering, fighting to survive. But she just kept a brave face, smiling and petting them with every little strength she could muster. Margaret's fingers reached their fur. She stroked them gently, knowing these might be her last touches. She knew she wouldn't make it, so she kept on saying, "Take care of my dogs." Margaret's breathing grew shallower. Her heart was working overtime, trying to pump blood upward against gravity, but it was a battle it couldn't win. As the hours dragged on, cardiac arrest became inevitable. Margaret touched their noses one last time, feeling their breath against her fingertips. Somehow, she knew they understood this was goodbye. The rescue workers never stopped trying. But sometimes, even the most heroic efforts aren't enough. Margaret's body simply couldn't survive the prolonged trauma of being trapped upside down. April 24th, 2001. A woman who had given her heart to 2 small puppies gave her life trying to save them. The rescue workers eventually managed to retrieve her body and the 2 puppies, Max and Luna, who survived their ordeal with minor injuries. They were taken to the local animal shelter, where they waited for new homes. The lava tube is still there, now marked with warning signs. The area around it has been fenced off to prevent other tragedies. Margaret Chen's final act was one of pure love. She couldn't save herself, but her sacrifice meant that Max and Luna lived to bring joy to another family. She's watching over them, proud of how far they've come. Her puppies did eventually find another family, and they were loved. In the end, perhaps that's what she would have wanted, for her puppies to be safe, even if she couldn't be there to see them grow up. It was November 19th, 2006. The van bumped along the dirt road toward Rio Kamui. 13 tourists sat inside, looking out the windows with growing excitement as they approached one of Puerto Rico's most famous underground rivers. Winfredo Lopez Luquis looked at his watch and adjusted the headlamp on his helmet. At 34 years old, he had guided hundreds of groups through these caves during his career. His NCRC Level 10 certification meant something in the caving community, and people trusted him underground because he had never let anyone down. But today, something felt different about the sound of rushing water echoing from below. Carlos Lopez unpacked the ropes from the back of the van while the tourists gathered around to listen. Winfredo explained the basic safety rules for cave exploration to 3 adults and 8 children, who stared at him with wide eyes. None of them knew that heavy rains had fallen the day before, and the river was running much higher than usual. The group started walking toward the Resurgencia area, which meant resurgence in Spanish. This marked the spot where the underground river emerged from deep in the earth after carving through limestone rock for thousands of years. The Rio Kamui had created channels with walls that reached 40 feet high, 12 meters, and the water moved fast as it carried rainfall from miles of underground passages. Winfredo led the way down the rocky path. Behind him, the tourists followed in a single line. The sound of rushing water grew louder with each step they took deeper into the earth. His teammate had warned him earlier that the river was flowing at 200 cubic feet per second, which was much higher than normal. They reached the edge of the wall and looked down at the river moving through the channel below. Its surface appeared calm, but hiding dangerous currents that Winfredo knew well from years of experience. Near the 6-foot waterfall, 1.8 meters, there was a hydraulic where water spun in circles. This was a spot where objects that fell in could get trapped forever, spinning until they sank. The tourists needed to see the river up close because they had traveled far for this adventure. Winfredo and Carlos began setting up their rope system while working quickly and carefully to secure anchor points. The tourists watched and took photos, while some looked nervous when they peered over the edge. The wall dropped straight down to a narrow ledge beside the churning water. Carlos got ready to go down first with his harness connected to the belay system. He would rappel down and check the river conditions because safety rules demanded someone inspect the area before everyone descended. The belay line ran through a carabiner at the top of the wall, and Carlos clipped his gear to the rope and started going down. The tourists gathered at the edge to watch as Carlos disappeared into the shadows below. Water spray came up from the hydraulic. At the bottom, Carlos moved along the ledge and stayed away from the waterfall while the hydraulic churned beneath him. Above them, Winfredo studied the setup and saw that the rope looked secure. The belay system worked properly, while Carlos moved carefully below and checked for problems in what seemed like a routine operation. But something bothered Winfredo as he listened to the sound of the water, which was louder than usual. The hydraulic looked more aggressive today as the river carried more debris than normal, with branches and leaves swirling in the current. His teammate's voice echoed in his memory about changing areas because the river was too high. The group depended on his expertise, so Winfredo clipped into the belay line, despite the warnings that began coming from above. Voices were clear and urgent as he tested the connection and felt the rope's tension. Carlos was still below, positioned safely away from the hydraulic, and the belay system could handle 2 people because he had done this before. But the second warning came louder as people told him to stay up there. He was already committed though, and the rope supported his weight as he began going down. The tourists watched 2 guides now, their adventure becoming more exciting as cameras clicked and whirred in what they thought was normal cave guiding. The third warning came as desperation when someone screamed at him not to go down there. Winfredo's foot slipped on the wet rock that was slicker than expected. A thin film of moisture covered the limestone from the hydraulic spray, and his grip on the rope shifted. Suddenly he was falling instead of rappelling, and though the belay system caught him, the momentum carried him toward the water, where he hit the river with a splash that echoed through the channel. The current grabbed him immediately with strength that was greater than he had expected. 200 cubic feet per second meant raw power, and the water had no interest in his 34 years of experience or his NCRC certification. The tension on the belay line yanked Carlos from his position as the rope connecting them became a liability instead of safety equipment. Both men disappeared behind the waterfall within seconds, dragged into the churning water by the rope that should have kept them safe. Above them, the tourists watched in horror as their guides vanished into the hydraulic circular current. The peaceful cave exploration became something terrifying as children began crying and adults shouted questions that had no answers. Carlos felt the hydraulic's power immediately as the water pushed him down, then pulled him back up, then pushed him down again in an endless cycle. He managed to turn his body and dive under the falling water to reach the back of the hydraulic, where air existed in the space behind the waterfall. He gasped to fill his lungs before being pulled back into the spinning water. The belay line connected him to Winfredo, but also anchored him to the hydraulic's grip. 5 times Carlos fought his way to where Winfredo struggled against the current, and the rope allowed him to reach his partner, but not to escape with him. The first time Carlos touched Winfredo, he grabbed his arm and felt movement, but the current tore them apart before he could pull him up. The second time he reached Winfredo's shoulder and tried to lift his head above water, but the hydraulic spun them in opposite directions. On the third and final touch, Carlos managed to grasp Winfredo's harness, but his partner's body felt limp and unresponsive as the water pulled them apart once more. The belay line had jammed in the carabiner above, and the tourist holding the rope couldn't release it fast enough. Physics worked against them, creating tension that locked the system in what should have been a quick release. When the line finally came free, both men washed out of the hydraulic and into the calmer water downstream, where another guide jumped into the river to help. Carlos managed to untie himself and then Winfredo, dragging his partner's body onto a rock ledge where he began CPR immediately. He pressed on Winfredo's chest and breathed into his lungs while trying to force life back into his body. But the hydraulic had held them too long, and the water had won this battle against human experience and preparation. Carlos scrambled out of the river and ran for his phone to make the call that would change everything. At 12:09 p.m., Efrain Mercado received the emergency call and activated the NCRC Caribbean Region Response System. Teams mobilized and gathered equipment for the rescue operation that would follow. The 13 tourists were evacuated first, led through the cave system they had come to explore. Their adventure ended with tragedy as their photographs captured the moments before disaster struck, and they emerged into daylight shaken and silent. The recovery of Winfredo's body proceeded with careful precision as the rescue team worked as professionals but also as friends. They had trained with Winfredo and learned from his experience, respecting his skill and dedication to cave safety. They recovered him the way he would have wanted, with competence and dignity. At 4 p.m., the operation stopped, and the rescue team gathered around Winfredo's body to observe a minute of silence. The next days were difficult for the rescue team, as several members sought counseling. They struggled with the loss of their colleague and the violent randomness of the accident. The cave remained open, and the river continued flowing, and other guides would take other groups through the same passages. But the hydraulic at the waterfall had claimed its victim, and the Rio Kamui would always remember November 19, 2006. It was March 9, 2003. The tropical heat of Guerrero, Mexico blazed overhead as a group of tourists made their way to Gruta del Rio Xontalcoatlan. The group was typical of many tourist expeditions in the region. Poorly equipped visitors led by local guides who had learned the cave system through experience rather than formal training. The guides knew the passages well enough to navigate them, but they lacked safety training and equipment that professional cave operations required. This was adventure tourism at its most dangerous. The entrance to Gruta del Rio Xontalcoatlan was not a gentle opening. It was a steep canyon that dropped into darkness like a stone throat, waiting to swallow the unwary. The upper entrance required climbers to descend a treacherous slope of loose rock and unstable formations. Every step had to be carefully placed. Every handhold had to be tested before trusting it with your full weight. Maria Santos was excited about the adventure ahead. She had come to Mexico for vacation, seeking thrills and experiences she couldn't find at home. The group began their descent into the entrance canyon with casual confidence. As they climbed down the steep entrance, the tourists spread out along the slope. This was the first critical mistake. In unstable terrain, climbers should maintain vertical spacing to prevent rockfall from above. When multiple people climb the same slope simultaneously, anyone above becomes a potential killer for those below. Maria was partway down the entrance canyon, carefully placing her feet on narrow ledges and testing each handhold before committing her weight to it. The rock felt solid under her fingers, but appearances in caves are always deceiving. Above her, another tourist made a movement that would soon change the entire trip's course. It might have been a misplaced foot, a grabbed handhold that gave way, or simply the shift of body weight that disturbed the delicate balance of the slope. Whatever the cause, a rock broke free from the formation above. The stone that would move towards Maria like a bullet. Simple rock, probably nothing special. Just a few pounds of limestone that had been wedged in place for decades. The physics of falling rocks are brutally simple. A stone that weighs just a few pounds becomes a deadly projectile when it falls from height. Gravity accelerates it to lethal speeds in seconds. The human skull, for all its evolutionary strength, is no match for several pounds of limestone traveling at terminal velocity. Maria probably never saw the rock coming. In the dim light of the cave entrance, with her attention focused on finding her next handhold, she had no warning of the death hurtling toward her from above. The stone struck her in the head with the force of a sledgehammer, delivered with the precision of a sniper's bullet. The impact was devastating. The blow to her head caused immediate trauma that would have been fatal on its own. But worse, it made her lose her grip on the slope. Her hands released their hold on the rock face. Her feet lost their purchase on the narrow ledges. In an instant, she went from being a controlled climber to a falling object subject to the same physics that had just destroyed her skull. The fall down the steep entrance canyon was a nightmare of bouncing impacts and grinding stone. Maria's body struck the rocky slope repeatedly as she tumbled toward the darkness below. Each impact added new injuries to the massive head trauma she had already sustained. The other tourists watched in horror as Maria disappeared into the darkness of the cave entrance. The sound of her body striking the rocks echoed through the canyon. Then there was silence, broken only by the distant sound of falling stones settling into their new positions. The guide who had led them into this death trap now faced every tour leader's worst nightmare. A tourist was dead under his watch, killed by dangers he should have anticipated and prevented. But the immediate crisis was just beginning. Maria's body was now somewhere in the depths of the cave entrance, and someone would have to risk their own life to reach her. The group's first instinct was to climb down after her, but the guide had enough sense to stop them. The same unstable conditions that had killed Maria were still present. More people climbing the treacherous slope would only create more opportunities for additional rock falls. The entrance canyon had become a killing field. When the rescuers finally reached Maria's body, they confirmed what everyone already knew. The combination of the initial head trauma and the subsequent fall had been fatal. She had probably died instantly or within minutes of the initial impact. The injuries were so severe that survival would have been impossible even with immediate medical attention. The body recovery itself was a complex technical operation. The rescuers had to package the body in a way that would allow it to be lifted up the treacherous slope without causing additional rock falls. They had to coordinate the lifting operation carefully, with teams positioned at different levels to guide the body bag around obstacles and unstable rock formations. The recovery took hours to complete. Every stage of the operation carried the risk of additional casualties. The rescuers were acutely aware that they were working in the same conditions that had killed the tourist, and that any mistake could turn them into victims as well. When Maria's body was finally brought to the surface, the full horror of the incident became clear. What had started as a fun tourist excursion had ended in a preventable death. The combination of untrained guides, poorly equipped tourists, and dangerous cave conditions had created a perfect storm of tragedy. On December 3, 2011, 4 experienced cavers gathered at the entrance of a remote Illinois cave, prepared for their most challenging expedition yet. Chad McCain, Todd McCartney, Ralph Sawyer, and Jason Kern planned to spend 10 to 16 hours underground, pushing through water-filled passages with dangerously low airspace of only 6 to 10 inches. McCain was the newcomer to this specific cave system. McCartney, at 44, was the veteran who had explored these passages multiple times. Sawyer and Kern rounded out the experienced team. Their target was a water-filled section that had been challenging explorers for years, requiring cavers to crawl through frigid water with faces pressed against rocky ceilings. McCartney came prepared with extra cold water protection, wearing a neoprene hoodie over his wetsuit. The others had standard caving gear, knowing the cold would be their constant enemy. The water temperature would be brutally cold, and the low airspace meant panic could easily become a death trap. The 4 men entered the cave system and worked their way toward the water-filled passage. When they reached their target area, the reality became clear. The passage stretched ahead, filled with dark, cold water that reflected their headlamps. The ceiling dropped until there was barely enough space to keep their heads above water. McCain volunteered to lead upstream, despite being new to this cave. As he entered the water, the cold hit him like a physical blow. The water was 3 to 4 feet, 0.9 to 1.2 meters, deep, but the low ceiling forced him to crawl in an awkward position. He held his helmet in his hand to gain clearance, pressing his face against the rocky ceiling. The airspace dropped to 6 inches, then lower, until McCain encountered a section where the ceiling came within only 3 inches of the water surface. This was beyond dangerous territory with essentially zero margin for error. McCain hesitated, studying the passage and weighing the risks. McCartney, watching from behind, saw McCain's hesitation and made a fatal decision. His extra cold water protection gave him confidence to push further. He decided to take the lead, leaving his pack with the group to reduce his profile in the water. Holding his helmet in front for protection, McCartney moved past McCain and continued upstream. The water was freezing, but his neoprene gear provided enough insulation. He pressed his nose against the ceiling, breathing through minimal airspace as he pushed deeper into unexplored territory. The sensation was claustrophobic and terrifying. McCartney was essentially swimming through a water-filled tunnel with barely enough air to breathe. Every movement had to be deliberate and controlled. Panic would be fatal within seconds. McCartney continued for 40 feet, 12 meters beyond McCain's furthest advance, entering territory no human had ever explored. The passage twisted and turned, with the ceiling varying from 3 to 4 inches above the water surface. He was completely committed now, too far from safety to turn back quickly. As McCartney rounded a bend in the passage, the nightmare scenario unfolded. The passage didn't just continue straight ahead, it angled sharply downward. The ceiling that had been barely manageable at 3 inches suddenly dropped even lower, while the water level remained the same. In the bend, there was virtually no airspace left. McCartney found himself facing a water-filled tube with no room for his head above the surface. He tried to back up, but the tight confines made it nearly impossible to reverse direction quickly. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped in a flooded section with no air pocket. His lungs burned as he held his breath, desperately trying to find a way forward or back. But the bend had become a death trap. The cold water rushed over his face as he struggled against the rock walls, his movements becoming increasingly frantic as oxygen deprivation began to take hold. Then, everything went wrong. The others heard the first sounds of distress from around the bend. McCartney began kicking and thrashing in the water, his movements becoming increasingly desperate. At first, the team thought he might have found a section with more airspace and was working through a difficult spot. But the thrashing continued, becoming more alarming. McCartney's light was visible around the bend, but his movements were clearly those of someone in serious trouble. The controlled motions of an experienced caver had been replaced by frantic struggles of someone fighting for their life. McCain called out to McCartney, but there was no response. The thrashing became more violent, followed by periods of ominous silence. McCain moved upstream as quickly as possible in the restricted space, calling for his friend. When McCartney's light suddenly came into view, McCain's worst fears were confirmed. McCartney was clearly in trouble, his movements uncontrolled and desperate. Then McCain watched in horror as McCartney went underwater and didn't come back up. When he finally surfaced, he was floating face down next to the wall, completely motionless. McCain and Sawyer rushed forward, but the confined space made rescue attempts incredibly difficult. In the very low airspace with cold water and limited room to maneuver, even reaching McCartney was a challenge. Sawyer, overwhelmed by the situation and confined space, momentarily panicked. He went underwater, struggling against fear and claustrophobia that threatened to claim another victim. When he popped up in a small air bell, he had lost his helmet and light, cutting his face on the sharp rock wall. Now they had two people in distress and rapidly diminishing light sources. McCain knew time was critical. McCartney had been underwater for precious seconds, and brain damage could occur quickly without oxygen. McCain finally reached McCartney after about 45 seconds that felt like hours. He grabbed the unconscious man and began dragging him downstream toward Kern, fighting against the current and confined space. The nearest place to get McCartney completely out of the water was still over 600 feet, 183 meters away. McCain found a section with only 10 inches of water and more than a foot of airspace, enough to begin emergency treatment. When they rolled McCartney over, his condition was terrifying. His eyes were glassy and caked with mud, showing no signs of consciousness. McCain immediately began CPR, working in cramped conditions to restart his friend's breathing and heart. Sawyer and Kern joined the effort, working together to keep McCartney's head out of water while administering rescue breaths. The minutes that followed were the longest of their lives. In the cold, dark confines of the cave, with limited equipment and no possibility of outside help, they fought to save McCartney's life. McCain continued CPR while the others supported his efforts, knowing their friend's survival depended entirely on their actions. After 2 to 3 minutes that felt like hours, McCartney suddenly regained consciousness. The relief was overwhelming, but they knew they weren't out of danger yet. They moved him another 30 feet, 9 meters, downstream to a mud bank where he could sit up and recover. Now they faced new challenges. They had to get McCartney out of the cave quickly, but with very few remaining light sources. Sawyer and McCartney had both lost their helmets and primary lights during the emergency. McCartney only had one extra mag light, Sawyer had a couple of small mag lights, and Kern had one small secondary headlamp. McCain, who had been better prepared with backup lighting, shared his extra Apex and Phoenix lights with the others. But even with these resources, they were operating with minimal illumination for what would be a long and difficult journey to the surface. Working their way back toward the entrance, McCartney started off slow and lethargic. He coughed up water frequently, his body still recovering from the near-drowning experience. But gradually, he began to pick up speed, his strength returning as they moved away from the accident scene. The journey out was a nightmare of endurance and determination. They had to navigate a 300-foot-long, 91 meters crawl that explorers nicknamed the bathtub because it contained water with only 6 inches of airspace. Under normal circumstances, this would have been challenging but manageable. With an injured team member and limited lighting, it became a test of survival. McCain came up with an innovative solution for getting McCartney through the bathtub crawl. He tethered 2 Swago packs to his waist. These waterproof and buoyant packs created a makeshift flotation device. McCartney could rest his head and chest on the packs, while McCain pulled him through the section. The technique worked, but it was exhausting for both men. McCain had to drag his friend through 300 feet, 91 meters, of water-filled passage while navigating the cramped conditions himself. McCartney, still recovering from his near drowning, had to trust completely in his friend's ability to get him to safety. Hour after hour, they worked their way through the cave system. Every obstacle seemed magnified by their circumstances. As they neared the entrance, they encountered one final challenge. The entrance required a short climb. The team rigged a rope system, with some members helping from above and others supporting from below. Finally, 6 hours after entering the cave and 3.5 hours after the accident, all 4 men emerged into the winter air. McCartney was immediately taken to the hospital, where he spent 4 days recovering from his ordeal. The doctors confirmed that he had come very close to drowning and that the quick action of his friends had saved his life. The cold water had actually helped preserve his brain function during the period when he was unconscious.